Thank you very much, everybody. We're going to go on after this coffee break to the next part of the symposium. And kicking it off, we have Catalina Lozano, who's come to join us from the Tamayo Museum in Mexico. No? What did I say? I'm independent. Oh, independent now, right. From Mexico. Thank you very much. Please join me in welcoming her.
Hello, good afternoon. I would like to thank OCA for this invitation, especially Antonio and Katia, and all the team who's made this possible. So my presentation is advertised at Minor Histories Against Hegemonic Knowledge, and it's something I have been dealing with in my work as a curator for a while. I don't know if what I'm going to say reflects that title that closely, but I'll try to kind of stick to that idea. And I'm going to be quoting a lot of people during this presentation, because I thought it was important to kind of bring those different voices into the presentation. So I'm going to play this video while I speak for a while by Eusebio Siosi, who is a Wayuu artist from the northeast of Colombia. Because I wanted to show it, but I don't have time to show it and then talk, so I'm just going to show it while I talk. So maybe I just play a minute for you to get a sense of the sound, and then I'm going to turn it. To have to do that. As I often have done in the past few years when talking about my research and a point of departure for my work, I need to start by outlining a concept coined by Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, which is the coloniality of power. I find this necessary because it allows me to think historically about the world from what is now called Latin America. And in this case, it allows me to think through the epistemological implications of colonization, which are implicit in the formation of the institution at hand, that is the museum. In a nutshell, coloniality of power describes the pervasive social, economic, cultural, epistemological structures of colonialism based on the invention of race as a tool for social classification for the exploitation of labor force geared towards the accumulation of capital. As Carlos A. Jauregui puts it, for Quijano, the most significant historical implication of coloniality and its dynamics of racial classification is the emergence of a modern / colonial Eurocentric capitalist world. And the slash is important because of what follows. This, of course, is supported by epistemological constructions that sustain such regime. Broadly speaking, according to Quijano, they imply that Europe, and I'm quoting, Europe is civilized, non-Europe is primitive. The rational subject is European, non-Europe is the object of knowledge. Therefore, the science that studies Europeans will be called sociology, the one studying non-Europeans will be called ethnography. There is a myth, the Eurocentric myth, that tells that there is a logical line of progressive evolution from nature to Europe, or the West, as we call it. And this myth associates as inevitable the modern configuration of capital and civilization. But for Quijano and other critical theories working on the principle of coloniality of power, there is no modernity outside coloniality, and therefore there is no capitalism outside colonialism. Epistemologically speaking, Eurocentrism is characterized by three operations. The first one is a dualist classification between capital Europe and the civilized against pre-capital non-Europe and the primitive. And this classification is organized in a one-directional historical linearity that explains the superiority of the former over the latter. The second point is the naturalization of cultural differences through the idea of race. And the third is the distorted temporal relocation of all these differences by placing non-Europeans in the past, what Walter de Mignolo calls the denial of coevalness. And for him, the contemporary post-colonial theory should deny that denial of coevalness. Enrique Dussel developed the term transmodernity to acknowledge and assert the non-hegemonic, non-Eurocentric aspects of modernity. If we recognize that modernity and coloniality are interwoven and codependent, there must be non-hegemonic sides to that formation that come from the vanquished, and I say vanquished for want of a better word, and also to kind of maybe reference Benjamin a bit. Dussel says that, and I'm quoting, "In this way, modern reason is transcended, but not as a denial of reason as such, but of the violent, Eurocentric, development-centered, hegemonic reason. It's a transmodernity as a world project of liberation where alterity, which was coessential to modernity, is also realized." Evidently, the formation of modern nation-states in Latin America is linked to this coloniality of power, and it's predominantly the white elites who have held power effectively since independence, with the recent exception of Bolivia. The nation-state is also a colonial enterprise, even if it happened after independence from the Spanish crown. And it champions what we call internal colonialism, the imposition of a hegemonic culture over all other cultural forms in a given territory. Museums, of course, play a very important role in the fabrication of national narratives. Until very recently, they predominantly incorporated a very Eurocentric version of history and art history, and here I include historical, natural history, anthropological, and ethnographic art museums. In any case, indigenous cultures were and are instrumental to such narratives. They are used to reinforce the idea of nation. For instance, in Mexico, the logo of the national airline Aeromexico features an eagle warrior, or the national coat of arms also references Mexica tail, etc. And this is done while denying the present living conditions and vulnerability of indigenous people. The language of discovery and heritage is embedded in the epistemology that produces the museum, especially the National Museum. For example, the segregation of people with no writing to prehistory. And with this, I would like to remember the denial of coevalness I mentioned before. And we need to be aware of who defined writing and in which terms. Museums, in their modern foundational conception, are associated with preservation, which already defines the fate of the objects in their collections. Not only objects as artifacts, but all types of material and immaterial objects. And preservation is done in certain specific terms. And I think you were talking about preservation before. I think it's very interesting to consider other forms of preserving or destroying for memory. Colonial collections have reproduced the idea of saving the last vestiges of disappearing cultures. Today, with exceptions, the narratives associated with indigenous art either deem it primitive or folkloric. And here always talking about or from Latin America. I don't want to generalize everything that I'm saying. So in the process of colonization, all the peoples of the Americas were flattened to the category of Indians, and the vastness of the continent and of the people that inhabited it was reduced to one category. Indigenous art is called indigenous art because of a process of colonization. And this colonization cannot be undone, but decolonization could be achieved, at least I hope. As artist Fernando Palma told me, there are over 70 native languages in Mexico. So talking about indigenous art in general is quite a vast generalization. But a common denominator, and I'm quoting Fernando here, is that they are all in cultural disadvantage to the hegemonic culture. And they're most often disguised as touristic industry. It is important to note that indigenous communities are not living fossils, end of quote. In an interview with Brazilian anthropologist Pedro Cesarino, Krenak writer Ailton Krenak stresses the fact that he has not, quote, perceived a separation between living and making art in any of the matrices of thought in the native peoples I have encountered, end of quote. In the modern Eurocentric division of labor, the specialty of art has been commodified, which leads to the supremacy of authorship and the well-known figure of the genius, normally the white male genius, against the artisan, which is what many times indigenous artists are called. The canonical history of art sustains all arguments to glorify certain models of art production over others and erase a vast diversity of ways in which art is a way of relating to the world. In this process of hegemonic art history writing, conceptual art, for example, is praised in terms of an univocal modern Western development. All this happens while ignoring the conceptual complexity embedded historically in indigenous art. José Rabasa highlights the provincialism of applying Western categories to interpret indigenous affect. And he's talking about the case, for instance, of the so-called melancholy of Montezuma, that is interpreted as melancholy by the Spanish conquistadors. And he asked the question, is it really melancholy what Montezuma is feeling? And isn't that interpretation a way of telling the story of how he gave up his empire? And he also warns about the limiting implications of the divide between written and oral history, which leaves non-alphabetic writing segregated. From where I stand as a contemporary art curator born in Colombia and living in Mexico, I recognize a current attitude of non-indigenous people before indigenous art. And this is of the extreme essentialism. So there is a myth of a romantic stereotype and the idea of preconceived authenticity. As Jimmy Durham states, the question of technology is the question of who controls technology. And until recently, certain forms of art production had been considered minor, like textiles or ceramics, in the big Eurocentric narratives. This perpetuates and privileges certain media over other. At the same time, indigenous artists in the traditional museum narratives are asked to stick to their textile artisanal traditions to be authentic. And there is a pervasive notion that indigenous cultures are still, and they should be what other people think they are. So you hear a lot these comments about how indigenous someone is from a non-indigenous person, these judgments of authenticity. So for the sake of simplifying the argument, I would like to outline two ways in which indigenous art in Latin America participates in the contemporary art establishment and the way they come in and out of institutional frameworks. So on the one hand, I think there are indigenous artists who have gone through college, through art schools, and have continued sort of the path we know towards an artist's career. But there are also indigenous artists that did not participate in this contemporary art formation and world because their work was embedded in other contexts and they were producing art in other ways. But nonetheless, their work has called the attention of contemporary art curators, and their work has been featured in contemporary art shows. I only find important pointing this out because of the institutional implications and the ways in which indigenous art gets absorbed or not by modern and or Eurocentric institutions, but also, and more importantly, the way in which it opens up windows of thought and of historical awareness we so much need. And one aspect that is important is how the different realms in which an artist works can be reconciled. Aymara, artist, poet, musician, and now director of the Museum of Ethnography and Folklore in Bolivia, Elvira Espejo Aica, highlights how challenging she found to go back to her community after having gone to the fine arts school in La Paz. She didn't find hard to go back to the community in terms of not finding an understanding of her practice in the community, but on the contrary, it made her realize how much the academy didn't really understand the other side. So there was a one-way street in which the academy was imposing certain forms of knowledge and knowledge production, and that she couldn't translate into her own community and back. So now I'm gonna talk about. So I want to talk about some artists. I've been talking about these issues. Oh, no. And I want to talk about basically two artists that are participating more actively in the contemporary art world, if we want to call it. But then about two artists that probably were producing art in their own communities, and then kind of have become part of a wider art discourse. So Fernando Palma is an artist preoccupied with the survival of a language some of his older relatives still speak, Nahuatl. Although he did not learn it as a child, he has learned it at an older age, which for him has meant understanding that a language expresses ideas about reality which are not necessarily translatable. The loss of a language is also the loss of a way of understanding and mediating reality. This is embedded in Palma's commitment to his own community in Milpalta, one of the districts of Mexico City, but the most rural one, where agrarian practices are very much alive. Nahuatl is a logosyllabic language, which means that written words are composed of logograms and phonograms. He applies this knowledge to an exercise of toponymy, which reveals the way in which the names given to places by the Nahuatl people express more than anything the relationships between the territory and the living beings that inhabit it. And these flags are flags that are produced to name specific places. Trained as an industrial engineer before devoting himself entirely to art, Palma has developed a body of work that includes a variety of media. He is mainly known, however, for his makeshift electronic installation, where characters are animated often through interaction with the public. Palma designs and programs the circuits himself, but his only interest in this type of technology seems to be to counteract the logic that created it. Together with his mother and sister and other people from Atocpan, and here I'm really referring to other forms of institutions that may be useful to think about the museum as well. Palma founded 17 years ago Calpuli Tecalco, an organization focusing on the research and preservation of the cultural and natural heritage of indigenous cultures, especially the traditional knowledge of the peoples of the south of the Anahuac River's basin. For Palma, community in the indigenous sense, and I'm quoting, is not restricted to the human group, but it grants personhood to plants, animals, things, and humans. Therefore, it knows that its acts have consequences that risk damaging the friendship that is built with these other persons. And he says that in Nahuatl, in his town, people say, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing this correctly, I'm afraid, but Tlein talpinawitzli nochi Castilancuepa, which means what a shame everything became Hispanized. So back to the pictures. So, Inahuaycalpulitecalco, is an organization. Inahuaycalpulitecalco as an organization is looking for the healing of the land, and this is done through different activities that involve artist residencies for indigenous artists worldwide and the protection of native corn, as well as agricultural practices and language. So I'm gonna talk about Eusebio Siosi, which is the artist whose video we were watching before. Sorry, I have too many different media here. I'm getting a bit, maybe I'll just. Eusebio Siosi is a Wayuu artist of the Ipuana clan. He is from Riohacha in the northeast of Colombia. He has trained as an architect, but also became involved in his artistic movements in Riohacha. His practice revolves around the processes of acculturation suffered by the Wayuu people, and recently has concentrated in the Yona, a traditional ceremony, and the figure of the Utsu, or the dreamers, who are women who mediate in the realm of dreams. Eusebio tells artist Maria Isabel Rueda in a recent interview that we Wayuu believe and recognize this activity as a generator of change and answers. I mean the Yona ceremony. Being aware of how the act of telling experiences and events orally contributes to collective work creates a commitment to undertake this kind of ritual. To do it, you need to involve a great deal of the population, from the people who slaughter cattle to the ones who make the food. So framed within performative practices, Siosi develops his work as an attempt to understand the negative effects that arihunas, or outsiders, can have on his culture, both because of the direct impact on the environment, but also in the Wayuu social tissue. And as Palma, Siosi thinks it is very important to talk and ask for permission to nature, to the soil and the plants before acting. In a way, he is a cultural activist advocating for Wayuu cultural practices. So this is the work of Fernando Palma. And now I want to talk about one case of one artist called Abel Rodriguez, who is a 72-year-old artist. Abel Rodriguez is an Onuya artist, and he's known as a knower and namer of plants. And he is from the region where the rubber exploitation was most violent, in the infamous Arana House and its headquarters. And these are the headquarters of the Arana House, which, I mean, I guess some of you know about the rubber exploitation in the Putumayo by the Peruvian and British companies that Roger Casement related in his reports. Recently, I saw an advertisement to visit this place, and it promotes it as a place isolated in time. So again, we see this denial of coevalness happening everywhere. After working as a guide and teacher to botanical researchers, Don Abel started drawing by heart all the plants he knew, their living cycles and their relationship with other beings. This was encouraged by Tropenbos, an NGO dealing with research and protection of the tropical forest. The result is in contrast with the illustrated knowledge of the botanical expeditions carried out by several waves of European scientists, where native knowledge would be appropriated and erased as such, turned into discoveries. Colombian science historian Mauricio Nieto asserts in relation to the Spanish botanical expeditions in South America in the 18th century that, and I quote, indigenous peoples of the Americas did not share with Linnean Europeans of the 18th century notions such as gender or species, nor did they understand concepts like anti-rheumatic, sudorific, or solvent. The Spanish, however, had no problem in borrowing and distorting popular histories to legitimate their discoveries. According to Nieto, translation would be a much more appropriate word than discovery to describe the process by which European colonial scientists got to know and appropriate native species in the colonies. The work of Don Abel, or Abel Rodriguez, has now been shown in several contemporary art exhibitions, even though he doesn't think much of the act of drawing, giving more importance to the ancestral knowledge he has. So I actually this morning was watching an interview with Abel Rodriguez, and when asked about his drawings, he said he didn't really care much about them. He made them because they came out somehow when remembering the plants of the, and now he lives in Bogota, but remembering the plants of the Amazon and where he grew up and lived. But he doesn't think, I don't think he thinks of them as art. He just thinks of them as something he's done. But his main concern is keeping the knowledge of he has about these plants and the environment. So finally, I don't know this artist very well, but someone pointed me towards his work, which I found quite amazing, so I wanted to show it to you. I'm sorry, the images I have are not of great quality. This is Bruce Rubio, who is a Bora Huitoto artist from the Peruvian Amazon. And his paintings conflate an interest in the cultural heritage of his people with his concerns about the present and the future of the region, which has been heavily affected by all related contamination. So where Bruce lives, some of the worst cases of oil spills have happened recently. He paints on tree bark called Yang Chama. He treats and flattens, and with natural dyes and with brushes he makes from vegetal fibers. He says his paintings are acts of rebellion against the acculturation his people are experiencing. For him, tradition is rebellion. And recently his work has been acquired, for instance, from the collection of the Mali Museum in Lima, and now is being shown nationally and internationally, although he continues to live in his town in the Amazon. This is really bad quality, I'm sorry. Let's leave this one up. So finally, Ailton Krenak, the writer I mentioned before, talks about, and I quote, expanding the ordinary time of our relationships and to make possible the creation of voids for visions, for people's feelings, for the elaborations that a collective can have on a dream. When you have an experience of expansion of time, we start thinking in much wider periods, and when my thought achieves touching an idea that goes beyond the perception of a place, of a territory, of a given place in geography, I start to think about that environment that we share, Earth, a planet. That for me is what I could experience as an idea of a cosmovision. is not a total vision, but an open vision. For Krenak, art is a window, or it opens windows. So I guess the museum needs to open those windows, and instead of trying to be part of the universal project, it should be open, and that means the huge challenge of expanding its time and in different ways. To think the museum from here, from the notion of coloniality, allows to challenge it through the notion of transmodernity as an affirmation of alterity. I'm not capable of naming that alterity here and now, but I think we need to open those windows. For Palma, and I quote, "The museum as an institution that is part of the nation state is not institutionally equipped to value those expressions." And he's referring to the artistic expressions of the indigenous people that have religious connotations or ceremonial functions. Nonetheless, being part of the art world, it can be a forum for discussion, and it can help to foster indigenous participation in the world. And I'm thinking also of this idea Katia mentioned before of the fire, and the fire being related in Western cultures to terror and kind of death. But for many people, fire is a healing force. So maybe these museums of fire could be considered as museums that need the healing of fire in them. So together with Palma, I think a successful decolonization of the museum cannot be achieved if there isn't a wider decolonization of culture and experience. This opening up must imply the vindication of other learning processes that don't necessarily pass through the hegemonic channels, but also it means to change, and by that I mean decolonize those channels so that they can be a channel for alterity. To the question, is it enough to broaden the modernist art historical canon through the politics of inclusion? I would say no, because I think that's already been done and it's not fully working. And to the one, is the museum per se an obsolete model for indigenous practices? I would say no, hoping that instead of dumping the idea of the museum altogether, those windows can be open. And I think one of the most important things would be to have, at least in Latin America, I know some other places have achieved this a bit more, is to have more indigenous curators and programmers in institutions. Because that's really lacking. I have the exception I mentioned of Elvira Espejo, who is an Aymara artist and the director of a museum in La Paz, but that's a big exception in these situations. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Catalina. And I'd like actually to take this opportunity to give you a proper introduction, which I failed to do earlier on. I'd like to say that Catalina is an independent curator and writer. Her research interests and curatorial practices are focused on minor historical narratives that question hegemonic forms of knowledge. She recently co-edited the book Crawling Doubles, Colonial Collecting and Affects with Mathieu Abonnec and Lotte Arndt. And as she already told us, Catalina is from Colombia. So now I have the great pleasure to ask you to welcome with me Gerald McMaster, who is a curator, artist, and author. He is professor of Indigenous Visual Culture and Critical Curatorial Studies at OCAD University. With over 30 years of international work and expertise in contemporary arts, critical theory, museological, and indigenous aesthetics, he has gained a thorough understanding of transnational indigenous visual culture and curatorial practices. So now please join me in welcoming Gerald McMaster.
While this is being set up, I'd like to acknowledge the Sami peoples of Norway and land on which we stand, which is a normal practice we do in North America, to acknowledge indigenous peoples. The paper will cover today what I'm going to be talking about. We'll cover the recent developments in Indigenous contemporary art in Canada. And unfortunately, I don't have a map of Canada. We are a very large country with a very small population. If any of you know your geography, I hope you will at least know where some of the cities in Canada lie. So I'll be talking about them. So I wanted to do a kind of a discussion about the case studies of a number of institutions, major cultural institutions in Canada, such as the National Archives, the National Gallery, which are located in our national capital in Ottawa. Also, I want to talk about the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Art Museum of the University of Toronto, and the power plant, which is in our largest city in Toronto. And then I want to address also the Vancouver, Edmonton, and Winnipeg art galleries. My focus today will be on something that has come to the fore in Canada in the last number of years, and that is the Truth and Reconciliation, in which the country has had to come to terms with colonization, but with regards to the residential schools in which a lot of the younger folks over the past 100 or so years were sent to be assimilated. And whilst in these institutions for a number of years, they experienced many negative ramifications of these institutions. Some, of course, would say they experienced some positive, but on the whole, I think it's quite a negative reactions. And so the Truth and Reconciliation was to get at the core of understanding what the experiences of these students were, many of whom are quite elderly now, of course, because the residential school system died down in the late 60s and early 70s. But from the Truth and Reconciliation came upwards to 70-odd recommendations called Call to Action. And so what I want to talk about today in terms of the institutions in Canada about whether these calls of actions have or have not been considered as a way forward. This might include how institutions address the hiring of curators, for example, strategic collecting, exhibition presentations, and public programming. I don't want to spend too much time on the historical efforts undertaken by Indigenous artists to strategically position their artistic practices within the discursive frameworks of the leading art museums in Canada, but suffice to say, the shift from when Indigenous contemporary artists were ghettoized within ethnographic museums to now moving into the art museums is quite a remarkable story, and hopefully some of it will come out here in my discussion. The shift could be described as a political empowerment staged through the struggle for voice. And of course, I will define voice. I have talked about voice in other situations, voice about authority, about perspective, representation, visuality, multivocality, and so on. But these struggles include the changing of the canon, for example, the narrative canon that we understand in larger institutions, such as the exhibitionary canon, and the structures within a number of institutions. So I want to talk about many of these places. So let us begin. This is from the National Library and Archives Canada. Photographer, this is Jeff Thomas, who's a photographer himself. His archival work from the Library and Archives Canada took place in 1994 and included the researching the names and identity of Indigenous peoples in over 100 historical photographs. His task was to change the racist captions that the images had been given, though his intention was not to rid the images of their original captions. Rather, Thomas's new captions were placed ahead of the old ones, which were kept intact. The Library and Archives has documented the history of Canada since its inception and contains material in all types of formats from across Canada and around the world. It includes information on immigration, genealogy, and family history, First World War, Aboriginal history, Aboriginal heritage, and census information. The work Thomas did in the Library and Archives Canada helped change the way they and other and sister institutions understood and presented Indigenous art and history. Thomas's in-depth research into the identity of Indigenous peoples, families, and communities in the historical photographs changed the way that exhibitions were curated at the library at the National Archives, which then affected the ways in which other institutions understood and looked at their Indigenous collections, such as the George Eastman House in Rochester, New York, where Thomas was invited to guest curate an exhibition on Edward Curtis's photographs. And it also put him in touch with me when I was working at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, where he curated this exhibition called The Emergence from the Shadow, First Peoples Photographic Perspectives. Historical photographs of Indigenous peoples were placed alongside more contemporary Indigenous works, creating an opportunity for artistic, cultural, and ideological exchange. Included artwork from contemporary artists included Barry Ace, Marianne Barkhouse, Rosalie Favell, Greg Hill, Shirley Nero, and Greg Statz. The twin conceptions of reciprocity and reconciliation have become, in Thomas's view, even more pronounced within the museum since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, though he is unsure whether it is real or not, or will have any lasting change, because the issues are systemic. It will take time to see whether or not the Truth and Reconciliation has made a lasting impact on Indigenous communities. One thing that is observable from his perspective is that non-Indigenous communities are beginning to see First Nations people as fully realized, multifaceted, and contemporary, as simply opposed to just simple cliches. The archival work that was done by Thomas at the Library and Archives Canada and the subsequent exhibitions that he curated were instrumental in shifting public opinion about First Nations peoples' art and artists, both present and historical. That said, Thomas believes that more grassroots organizations such as the Idle No More movement of a few years ago have done more for Indigenous people. The Truth and Reconciliation's call to actions are important, but they are institutional and therefore must abide by certain rules, whereas grassroots movements have a bit more freedom and flexibility in their demand. This is the National Gallery of Canada, also in Ottawa. New building built in 1989. And since 1992, when the National Gallery put on its first major international Indigenous contemporary art exhibition called Land, Spirit, Power, First Nations at the National Gallery of Canada, it wasn't till over a decade later, in the beginning of the 2000s, when it began to create permanent installation and permanent exhibitions devoted to incorporating historical, Indigenous, as well as contemporary art. And it's only since 2002 that a young man by the name of Greg Hill became the assistant curator in the contemporary art department of the National Gallery, which specialized in the collecting of Aboriginal art. As well, another curator who was hired, non-native, is Christine Lalonde, and Christine is the curator of Inuit art. Together, Greg is Indigenous and curator of Indigenous art. Christine, the curator of Inuit art. They make up the contemporary art department, Indigenous art department. The National Gallery of Canada's responses to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action are evident in their current and future programming, and also their current renovations that are just happening as we speak. They are the new leaders in advancing Indigenous curatorial practice with the Department of Indigenous Art. Over the last decade, they have mounted some of the most important exhibitions, such as the quinquennial international exhibition called Sagahan. Their recent exhibition included a retrospective of Alex Janvier, and 25 by 25 years of exhibition announcements from 25 Indigenous artists. This could be seen as the gallery's first deliberate effort in consolidating a history of exhibitions on contemporary Indigenous art in Canada. This coming summer, 2017, they will open two major survey exhibitions with an Indigenous art focus, one called Canadian and Indigenous Art, 1968 to the present, and the other one, Canadian Indigenous Art from Time Immemorial to 1967. Along with the completion of the total overhaul of the gallery, to which the gallery director and CEO Mark Meyer describes it as rearticulating the story of art in Canada by integrating Indigenous art and photography into the narrative. These current exhibitions reflect the National Art Gallery's commitment to rewriting the history of art in Canada. This vision seems to be instrumental in the decision of moving the Inuit art collection from the gallery's lower floor or the basement into and throughout the Canadian art galleries. In terms of governance, the gallery's mandate and its staff do not seem to suggest any other further changes other than what I just described. This is the facade of the new Art Gallery of Ontario, which was designed by Frank Gehry. Following the unveiling of the new facade in 2008, the Art Gallery of Ontario, one of the most prestigious cultural institutions in the province, as well as in Canada, undertook a campaign to rebrand and revision the identity of the gallery and its relationship to the larger cultural fabric of the city, the province, and the nation. The mission of the gallery states that we are to bring together with art to see, experience, and understand the world in new ways, which also encompasses a vision to gather people together to create community through art. The AGO's relationship to the Indigenous communities has been visible through numerous efforts in providing a platform for Indigenous voices to be present within the gallery. In 2005, when I became and was appointed the curator of Canadian art, I was the first curator of Indigenous heritage, for example, to hold such a position. During this time I was in the position, I had the opportunity to acquire some of the most important historical and contemporary Indigenous pieces. This piece here is by a Haida artist, dated approximately 1840s to 1850s. Cost us several $100,000. I don't know what that translates into Norwegian kroners, but it's a lot of money. And then the work on the right is a contemporary Inuit artist by the name of Shuna, which is a very, very large drawing. So together, trying to purchase contemporary art to contribute to the overall gallery's collecting practices was very important. So it's during this time when I was at the Art Gallery of Ontario that I also managed to put on some of these exhibitions. For example, this one here called New Modernities in a Post-Indian World called Remix. And the artist whose work you see, this teepee, is by Kent Monkman. A more recent exhibition that I did was called Before and After the Horizon, Anishinaabe Artists in the Great Lakes, which I co-curated with a curator from the Smithsonian Institution, who prior to that was at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And in 2010, I curated this exhibition called Inuit Modern, Samuel and Esther Sarek. Do come in, find a seat. I'm sure, I know they're hard to find, but there are seats back there. After I left, my successor, Andrew Hunter, his priorities were to acknowledge the Indigenous art in Canadian art history, to follow the legacy of equitable representation for Indigenous artists and artists of color that I had earlier established. Hunter is also keen on creating opportunities for Indigenous colleagues to participate in the upper management of the Art Gallery of Ontario, To initiate changes, Hunter uses his position now to create networks of allies within the institution. Historically, the representation of Indigenous voice at the Art Gallery of Ontario's program in Canadian art tended to be isolated. Instead of the traditional contextualization of Indigenous art as a chapter within a colonial art historical narrative, Hunter, as I did, aims to include Indigenous voice throughout the entire Art Gallery of Ontario. Hunter recently was instrumental in the arrival of this young lady, Wanda Nanabush, at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Recognizing issues within Indigenous representation at the Art Gallery of Ontario, Hunter strongly advocated for having an Indigenous voice and perspective in the programming of the art of the gallery. In a way, the creation of a curator for Indigenous and Canadian art was Hunter's criticism of the institution. To Hunter, failure in respectfully represent Indigenous voices reflects issues with true diversity within the gallery. At first, he faced a lot of pushbacks from the upper administration, something that I went through, of course, during the time I was there, because the role just simply did not exist. The creation of a role required a redistribution of logistic and resources within the institution, how to create a position that was meant to disrupt while at the same time using a formal cooperative corporate language, I should say, and how to write the role that would empower the Indigenous individual without upsetting the institution. And these were just some of the main challenges for him. So this is Wanda in her recently quite interesting exhibition, which is about Toronto, and included some Indigenous art, but mainly mainstream artists. So she received quite a number of accolades for this exhibition. This is the Art Museum at the University of Toronto. It established itself as a location for exploring and experimenting interdisciplinary projects on critical subjects or thematic concerns relevant in contemporary culture. They achieve and maintain goals in its missions and visions through the tool of education and discourse, which it has proven to great tools in empowering Indigenous curators and artists to be active producers of Toronto and Canadian contemporary culture. The Master of Visual Studies and Curatorial Studies program at the University of Toronto is one of the leading curatorial programs in Canada. It is led by Barbara Fisher, who is also the Executive Director of the Art Museum. Curatorial graduate students from the program have direct access to the resources and the networks of the Art Museum. Recognizing the amount of resources at the institution's disposal, Fisher uses the program to provide a platform for a period of 2 years, for example, to bring in Indigenous curators and artists to work on projects that express Indigenous points of view in their art. This direction of the program aligns with the Art Museum's original vision and mission, which already had a long history of working with significant Canadian Indigenous artists such as Carl Beam, Edward Pottrar, Rebecca Belmore, and recently Kent Monkman, amongst many others. The influence of the Truth and Reconciliation has been less at the Art Museum, but greater within the university as a whole. Wanda Nanabush, who I just showed you a few moments ago, who was one of the first Indigenous curators in residency as a student of the program, it was during her period of study where she also helped develop the acquisitions policy for the collecting of Indigenous art at the Art Museum. Other notable Indigenous graduates recently from this program include, this is John Hampton on the right and Cheyenne Turions on the left. The goal is to foster a collegial relationship between academics of Indigenous and settler ancestries. All three are formally mentioned Indigenous graduates were awarded with an Indigenous curator in residency to provide them a greater influence within the Canadian art and academic communities. However, due to changes to municipal and federal funding for the art, the program is currently on hold, waiting for Fisher and her team to find alternative venues to raising money for this position. The Art Museum is developing a plan to install a permanent position of an Indigenous curator in residence. Of course, that's what they plan. This unique vision requires that the Art Museum pursue an unconventional approach to programming. The Art Museum's annual programming is coordinated by the Executive Director Fisher and one of his curators, Sarah Sheridan, who identify talents from different backgrounds and cultures. They then engage in extensive conversations between them, and over a long course of a couple of years, the two parties will begin to explore ideas and talk about issues that are close to them. The result is a wide range of exhibitions that critically examine art and culture through the lens of a personal history. It is this keen focus on the role of visual and intimacy that has allowed the Art Museum to program exhibitions that are capable of speaking to the conceptual cultural entanglement that was just referred to earlier. The last two exhibitions, here is one called Shame and Prejudice, A Story of Resilience by the artist Kent Monkman, which opened in February and was on for 2 months and garnered some of the most, how should I say, the community came out. It was amazing to see, and I'd never been to an artist opening like this before, where the gallery was packed and there were lineups out the door for 2 hours after the doors opened. And when it closed, similarly, the gallery had lineups all the way outside, so it really did bring the community together. And Kent was an artist who really began to pull apart this whole notion of the concept of Canada from an Indigenous perspective, bringing in and changing the space and doing almost a Fred Wilson type of reaction and response to how museums are to mining collections and bringing in his work, etc. So it was quite a phenomenal exhibition. This is Kent himself here. And then this exhibition called Form Follows Fiction, Art and Artists of Toronto, curated by the artist-curator Louis Jacob. Both of them, as I said, attracted critical acclaims from both sides, both inside and outside the artist community. The shows brought together people together and positioned them within an entangled and complex network of cultures and personal histories, where the history of contemporary Indigenous experience is also lively present in all the joys and pains, along with other communities that have shaped this place. This is the power plant, because it was a power plant at one time, so they just kept the name. The gallery's mandate, this is also in Toronto, the gallery's mandate states a public art gallery dedicated exclusively to contemporary visual arts from Canada and the world. It is a vital forum for the advanced artistic culture of our time that offers an exceptional facility and professional support for a diverse group of living artists while engaging equally diverse audiences in their work. The gallery's vision reads is to be a leading international center for contemporary art renowned for its diverse programming and exceptional commitment to groundbreaking contemporary art. Carl Beam's Columbus boat debuted in the power plant in 1992 to much acclaim. We have to remember that in the Americas in 1992, most of the Americas were celebrating the quincentennial of Christopher Columbus's arrival to the Americas. Meanwhile, Indigenous peoples were not celebrating. We're creating exhibitions as an anti-celebration, and this is just an example of one artist who took it upon himself to begin looking at this particular issue. It was the first exhibition by an Indigenous artist within the power plant at the time. A couple of years later, Faye Heavyshield, her exhibition Into the Garden of Angels. This is just an example of her work. In this exhibition, a young Indigenous artist by the name of Arthur Renwick was the curator, and he analyzed her sculptures which addressed her Blackfoot experience as well as her experience as a woman who was raised on the blood reservation and who was educated by Roman Catholic nuns. Also, many years later, and it was not until 2006 that the power plant began to change its focus and brought in a curator by the name of Nancy Campbell to curate an exhibition by Annie Poutigu. Annie Poutigu is an Inuit artist, and it was her first Canadian public gallery exhibition. Poutigu was then awarded the Sobey Award just in 2006, I believe. So is one of our featured speakers today, Dwayne Linklater, who was given a Sobey Award. This award is one of the most prestigious awards that contemporary artists can achieve. So Annie being the first indigenous artist of Inuit ancestry. Also in 2006, she was awarded the Glenfiddich Artist Residency in Scotland. And it was just around this time that the curators from the Documento were traveling around Canada looking at the artistic practices when they came across her work, and of course invited her to Documento, and you can see her there behind the man with the two crutches helping him. So she is standing there looking fairly lonely. But sadly, we lost Annie earlier this summer when her body was found in the Ottawa River. It was quite a shock, not only to Canadians, to the art community, but certainly to the Inuit community in the north. But this young artist who had a really fast rising trajectory of about 10 years just sadly lost life. And then just a few years ago, the power plant brought this exhibition from the Vancouver Art Gallery called Beat Nation, which was a collaboration with the Vancouver Art Gallery. And it was about this time that the power plant began really taking notice and paying attention to First Nations and Inuit artists. Earlier this year, they just gave a major exhibition to a local Toronto artist by the name of Maria Hupfield. And then in a few years' time, there'll be another exhibition on the artist Ashuna, which will appear at the power plant. I'm also in discussions with them to do a major exhibition for 2020. This is the Vancouver Art Gallery. So I'll move out of Toronto, move to the far west coast of Vancouver. Those of you who might be familiar with the city of Vancouver, it's a beautiful, beautiful city. You could probably relate to it with its mountains and its sea. I don't know if they have fjords there, but anyhow, I'm sure they call them something different. The Vancouver Art Gallery's mandate explicitly expresses that the museum pays special attention to the accomplishments of First Nations artists and the art of the Asia-Pacific region. The consensus metropolitan area, or I should say the census to the metropolitan area of Vancouver lists about 40,000 indigenous peoples, Aboriginal peoples, to be certainly one of the largest in the province of British Columbia. This was in 2006. It's almost 4 times the Aboriginal population of another city in British Columbia, Victoria, which has about almost 11,000. I give you those numbers just to give you a sense of the, when we talk about the narratives and the invisibility of indigenous peoples, I think in Canada we're finding now the visibility of indigenous peoples is becoming much more important. And so just give you some of the numbers that what we're seeing today in terms of the immigration or movement into rural areas, into the cities by indigenous peoples over the last number of years. And so in each of the major cities in Canada, you'll find vast numbers of indigenous peoples. So in their annual report in 2015, 2016, it also expressed a desire to educate young people through programming and outreach. These two desires collide in their educational outreach. For example, the museum created an educator handbook and personal guided tours for grades 1 to 12. For an exhibition, We Come to Witness, Sunny Asu in dialogue with Emily Carr. Emily Carr is one of the great Canadian artists of the early 20th century. The VAG also has a long history dating from the 1960s of presenting First Nations artwork from the Northwest Coast, up and down the coast. And its most recent exhibition is this one here, Charles Edenshaw. Edenshaw was an artist who lived from 1839 and died in 1920, and has been recognized as one of the most exceptional Haida artists and remains a really, really iconic figure of the Northwest Coast art. And so you can see the kind of the facade here with a gigantic banner calling attention to this fantastic artist. As well, the Vancouver Art Gallery now has one of the most significant collections of another First Nations artist by the name of Robert Davidson. Recently, a number of pieces were donated by a wealthy San Francisco collector. In its news release, the Vancouver Art Gallery noted that First Nations arts are typically found in museums of history and anthropology rather than in art museums. The art gallery stated that it wants to remedy this situation by building up its collection of Native art. The Vancouver Art Gallery director, Kathleen Bartels, explains in the news release that was released just a while ago, she says, the Gun collection greatly enhances our ability to show the history of art making in this part of the world while also providing an important counterbalance to the Euro-Canadian narratives of art making that are already in the collection. This young artist, who is a personal friend of Mr. Linklater, who's sitting in the back, this artist is Brian Jungen, born in 1970. He's part of a young generation of Vancouver-based artists, although he divides his time between there and in the north, who are currently bursting onto the international art scene. Jungen is a mix of Swiss and Canadian and indigenous heritage. He was raised on one of the indigenous communities, the Danaza Nation. His drawings, sculptures, installations explore elements of his own hybrid identity. Yet his approach transcends questions of ethnicity to explore the complex exchanges of goods and ideas in our globalized world. Jungen first came to public attention with his what year was this? In 2005, exhibition called Prototypes for a New Understanding, a selection of Nike Air Jordan trainers that he dissected and reassembled to resemble Northwest Coast masks. And this exhibition toured all across parts of Canada, as you can see here, and also came to Europe. I don't know if anybody in this room actually had an opportunity to see this guy's work. It's absolutely tremendous. So he takes apart running shoes and then rebuilds them into masks. And he takes apart golf bags and creates totem poles and that. So it's quite remarkable with what he does. More recently, as I said earlier about this exhibition, Beat Nation, which was developed in 2012, it is exhibitions such as these that are now reflecting a younger generation of artists who living in urban areas, who look at youth culture and Aboriginal identity in a very, very innovative and unexpected ways. They use hip-hop, they use popular culture, and a lot of hybrid kind of works and media and painting, sculptures, installations, and so on that are really reflective of the changing demographics of Aboriginal Indigenous peoples today in urban, not just in urban areas, but also, as we would say, on the res, back home in the Indigenous communities. This is now we move to Edmonton, which is just the next province over of Alberta. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with Alberta and Calgary in particular. Edmonton is the capital of Alberta. The census that was taken in 2006 in Edmonton states that there was around 52,000 Aboriginal peoples. Neither the mission nor its vision statement of the gallery includes any specific mention of indigenous art or artists, nor does it mention anything about its calls to action, the TRC's call to actions. There have been, since at least 2012, a handful of indigenous-focused exhibitions, with most of the exhibitions focused from last year, 2016, and into the future. There are currently no exhibitions on view, although just recently there was an exhibition called The Parallel Excavation, Dwayne and Tanya Linkleiter, which was curated by an indigenous curator collective called Osichuan Contemporary Art Collective. So this is an example here. In the same year, 2016, they brought in a traveling exhibition from the Mackenzie Gallery in Saskatchewan called the Indian Group of Seven, or the Professional Native Indian Artists Incorporated, and was presented and curated by a young indigenous curator. We move over to the next province of Saskatchewan, my home province. This is not a native guy. In fact, this guy is from New Zealand. But he stands in front of a new gallery that is going to be opening up this coming summer. It's called the Reme Modern, which is located, as I said, in the city of Saskatoon. It was formerly called the Mendel Art Gallery, if any of you are familiar with this area, this particular museum. This individual, the executive director, is Gregory Burke, and he says the art museum's biggest challenge now is how to adapt to the massive changes resulting from the continuing aftershocks of colonization, climate change, globalization, and technological advances. The relevancy of the art museum depends on its response. One of its principles is to be respectful of Canada's Indigenous communities and aims to be a leading center for contemporary Indigenous art and discourse. Wow, that's going to be amazing if that happens. Cree syllabics are also adopted on its website to acknowledge Saskatoon's large and continually growing Plains Cree population, and the fact that the Reme Modern is located on Treaty 6 territory. According to the website, once again, it says a dialogue is actively sought with Indigenous leaders in the region. In addition to the syllabics, Cree syllabics, to the vocabulary, the identity, it serves as signifiers to the museum's location and ambition as a leading center for contemporary Indigenous art and discourse. However, neither Burke, who is the CEO, nor his new chief curator, Sandra Guimarães, who is a Portuguese from Portugal, neither of them are Indigenous. As of yet, no Indigenous staffs have been hired, though in a lengthy post for Canadian Art in 2016, Burke and others on the Board of Trustees addressed some of these concerns, stating that he understands that they indeed do need to hire Indigenous staff. The final, I want to move now from First Nations to Inuit art. Although objects of art have been traded for centuries between Inuit hunters, the reason I wanted to talk about Inuit because they are an Arctic community, very similar, of course, in understanding what it is to live in the cold, what it's like to live in the Arctic, and such as the Sami who live in the Arctic, subarctic areas. More recently, there was a book, a fantastic concept, a book that was written by an Inuit by the name of Shilawat Kluche. And Miss Kluche was, I believe, a nominee a number of years ago for a Nobel Peace Prize. Her recent book is called A Right to be Cold. And I was quite interested earlier when the gentleman who started off today's proceedings, when he talked about his respect for the dark. So it's interesting how Indigenous people see these different moments in life and what it's like to live in the context of either darkness or in cold. So I just want to talk briefly now about the curation of Inuit art in Canada. Although objects of art have been traded for centuries between Inuit hunters, whalers, sailors, and explorers, the commercial Inuit art market, now a source of income for many northern communities, was only well established by the early 1950s. This was largely attributed to an artist from Toronto by the name of James Hudson, who traveled to the Arctic in 1948 and we returned with several small artworks, which he gave then to the Canadian Handicrafts Guild in Montreal. The Handicraft Guild helped secure a government grant for Houston's travel, which resulted in the first major Inuit art exhibition in Montreal in 1949, so it was quite a while ago. As the exhibition was a great success, the Canadian government decided to appoint Hudson as the crafts officer to help develop formal channels of art making in the north and to promote Inuit art in the south as a means of economic development. Through Houston's efforts, sponsored largely by the Canadian government, the Canadian Handicrafts Guild and the Hudson Bay Company, Inuit art cooperatives, were created in the 1950s and 1960s with the aim of selling art to a southern market. So these cooperatives began to expand in many of the northern communities, Arctic communities. Due to this structure in the early history of contemporary Inuit art, curatorial tasks largely fell to cooperatives, guilds, distributing agencies, dealers, government agencies such as the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs, arm's length relations with the Canadian Eskimo Arts Council, and organizations such as the more recent Inuit Art Foundation. The Canadian Handicraft Guild was originally established in 1905, and it began facilitating Inuit art exhibitions, as I said, in the early 1950s in the cities of Toronto, Calgary, and in the United States in cities such as New York, and in such major institutions as the National Gallery and the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. Largely as a form of self-promotion, the Canadian government established continued sponsoring international touring exhibitions of Inuit in Eastern and Western Europe. They may have even come to Norway, I don't know, but I have to check on that history. They also sent Inuit art to South America and to the Middle East. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a widespread concern that authentic Inuit art had vanished, where collectors were nostalgic for the past and concerned about the future of Inuit art. Richard C. Crandall states in his book, Inuit Art, A History, that the Winnipeg Art Gallery's exhibition, Looking South, was a sort of turning point, and this was an exhibition in 1978, was the sort of turning point that acknowledged a changed Inuit culture and art where the work displayed was directly influenced by Southern non-Inuit culture, including subject matter such as airplanes and snowmobiles and using non-traditional materials such as plastic. In the introduction to the catalog, Inuit art historian Jean Blodgett admitted that Inuit art was an art of acculturation, as it was made to be sold to the southern market. Crandall states that this exhibition was the admission that contemporary Inuit art was separate and distinct from the art of the prehistoric and historic periods, which was previously denied by many of those in the field. Although this time was tumultuous, the 1980s brought a growing interest in Inuit art from public art galleries such as the National Gallery of Canada, the Canadian Museum of History, the Art Gallery of Ontario, and others who previously viewed Inuit art largely from an ethnographic perspective. In her article, Almost 50 Years of Inuit Art Exhibitions in 1997, Maria von Finkenstein points out that when looking at the history of Inuit art in the 20th century, the majority have been curated by two people. Jean Blodgett, who is affiliated with the McMichael Canadian Art Museum, and Darlene White, who is with the Winnipeg Art Gallery. This is the Winnipeg Art Gallery here. And none have been curated by Inuit themselves until recently. We're now finding that young Inuit are beginning to curate exhibitions. A notable curator of Inuit art was Ingo Hessel, author of several books on Inuit art. He guest curated with me the exhibition that I showed you earlier, Inuit Modern. Others included the Christine Lalonde, who I showed you, who's now at the National Gallery of Canada, who is an independent curator, and many, many other young people are now beginning to continue to come forth and curate Inuit art. But it's the Winnipeg Art Gallery, this is one of the shows here, that has been really the leader and the promoter of Inuit art since the 1950s, holding one of the world's largest collection of Inuit art and having presented over 180 exhibitions. This just gives you a sample of some of the exhibitions that have been curated. Winnipeg, as a city, which is in the central part of, right in the central part of Canada, is a mix of course, European, but in terms of Indigenous peoples, it's a mix of Métis and First Nations. And the population is around 68,000 people, making it one of the largest urban areas where Indigenous peoples are living. And I don't have any numbers of how many Inuit are living in Winnipeg itself. But Winnipeg itself, as I said, is the center, really, of where Inuit art has been presented. The gallery has had a full-time position of Inuit art since the early 70s in the personage of Darlene White, who herself has curated over 76 exhibitions at the gallery. And I wanted to skip right to the end and show you one final slide. Finally, sometimes this year, ground will be broken for a new Inuit Art Center, which will be a link connecting the art of the people of the North and the South, where we can meet, learn, and create together. It'll be a community hub for exhibitions and programs, researching and learning, studio practice, and art making. This center will offer a unique opportunity for Canadians and the rest of the world to learn more about Inuit and Canadian history and culture. Ladies and gentlemen, just to conclude my remarks, earlier it was talked about the idea of the museums on fire being a generative, the idea of fire being a generative power. In my language, fire is referred to as the mother's heart, okay? And that's how we translate it, iskuteo. And I feel that it has been that kind of generative effect about what's happening in Canada. And I know that I was asked to come here to talk about the kinds of things that are happening within our country, which have been going on for the last 50 years or so, and how it's been the artists who have transformed the landscape and how they've influenced the discourse of the larger institutions across the country, and how it's artists who are continuing to change that particular discourse. But what we're finding now in the last number of years is a rise of young curators of Indigenous background who are also starting to change that discourse, starting to alter the narrative, if you will, of what we're saying. I know the young lady earlier today, I think, challenged the Norwegians to change its narrative, to look at the narrative of more inclusivity, to talk about the Sami as being a critical part of the element of a society. And that is what is happening in many parts of Canada today, and it's only been within the last 15 or so years in which the influence of Indigenous art and artists has begun to change and alter the narrative of who we are. Much more inclusive, much more reflective, and much more a refined approach as to the contributions of Indigenous peoples, not just to today, but to the history of this country. And we have to remind Canadians all the time, in this year in which we're celebrating, or Canada is celebrating its 150th anniversary, we as Indigenous peoples are now and always have been trying to tell them that Canada is not 150 years old, but we have to add 2 zeros to that, which is about 15,000 years old. So we have more to celebrate than just 150 years. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Gerald, for that very detailed presentation. I would like now to ask you all to welcome with me our next speaker, Anna Hudson, who is an academic and currently Associate Professor of Canadian Art History and Curatorial Studies at York University in Canada. Dr. Hudson is currently leading Mobilizing Inuit Cultural Heritage, MICH, a 6-year research project, creation of collaborations aimed at recovering, preserving, documenting, facilitating, and disseminating Inuit knowledge, culture, and creativity. Thank you very much. Please welcome Anna.
Turn my Wi-Fi on. That's it. Yeah. So when I come to that, we'll just come with it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for this opportunity. And Gerald, thank you for reminding us that we're on Sapmi land. So I would like to follow up with you on that. And thank you, Anders Sunna, for your framing of this event, and to the organizers for the great privilege of being here. As Katja mentioned, I'm at York University in Toronto, and I'm organizing, we're in the 3rd year, actually now almost 4th year, of Mobilizing Inuit Cultural Heritage, and it's a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada partnership grant, and these kinds of grants are meant to bring together academics, most of whom are non-Indigenous, sadly, with Indigenous groups, and in my case, Inuit, and along with not-for-profit and profit organizations, so that we imagine collective research creation endeavors that go beyond the academic walls. And on that note, I should say, I think that there's a follow-up, if I can suggest it. It's Universities on Fire, because as a Kalanat woman, I'm a non-Inuit woman. I would like it better to see an Inuit woman in my place, talking about mobilizing Inuit cultural heritage. Okay. This is a large-scale sculpture, and I'm just going to, if I go over time or go too long, please somebody yell at me. This is a Peter Boy sculpture. It's a very large piece, probably about 8 feet high, in Pavirnatuck. And Pavirnatuck is historically one of the important art-making communities in Nunavik, which is Arctic Quebec. And it's significant because the child is holding essentially an Inuktitut language of Inuit, an Inuktitut dictionary. And you see the mother holding a book also, and this is a sculpture in between the 2 public schools in Pavirnatuck. And but you see, what's most important actually is the dialogue between them, even though they're each holding texts. And as Anna Mai noted, it's the oral transition of knowledge that is most significant. But what I've been very interested in the mobilizing Inuit cultural heritage and bringing, sort of wrangling all of these various parts together, is to try to center within it an indigenous and specifically Inuit worldview, and to ask a couple of questions that I will return to as the course of the presentation. Where does tradition live today? And in particular, in the digital age today, where might it live in a digital as opposed to bricks and mortar context? So I'd like to take a different perspective then on the museum and think about it as a non-walled space or as a digital space. And can digitized or digital culture be effectively disseminated and repatriated? And there's some wrinkles within this for Arctic Canada in particular. And what is the potential of a digital archive in cyberspace? And what if that cyberspace was an indigenous cyberspace? And what might that mean? Just, I think, Gerald, you mentioned a map earlier. Not quite the right map, but here's the 4 major Inuit territories of Canada. Inuvialuit, Nunavut being the most recent territory. I mean, Inuvialuit's not really recognized. It's really part of Northwest Territories, really. Nunavut is its own territory, which is kind of an Inuit, non-Inuit government balance, a bit tricky. But it's meant to be founded on Inuit principles of traditional knowledge. Nunavik, which is part of the province of Quebec, so has sort of a semi-recognized. And Nunatsiavut, which is perhaps even less kind of recognized, but voracious in its endeavor to be recognized, the Inuit part of Newfoundland and Labrador. And then there's the growing urban populations, particularly Ottawa, but also in Toronto, and notably in Toronto, there are 2 new Inuit urban organizations. And so the whole question of what it means to be urban Inuit or urban Inuk is also an important one to consider. Gerald mentioned James Houston, and this is sort of usually where the story of Inuit culture in mainstream Canada begins, even though it's much older and much different and more complex than Inuit visual culture or handicrafts that were important for the establishment of an economy, a capitalist economy in Arctic Canada. So this is the brochure from 1951, Canadian Handicrafts Guild with the Department of Resources and Development. So Inuit were part of the Department of Resources and Development, which sort of sums it up right there. And then you see a walrus tusk carved, sort of recommended kind of approach to production that would be very saleable on the market. And you see it's got traditional hunting scenes, these kind of spearing scenes, and sort of a coming together of animals that was symbolic from an Inuit context, but probably a little understood from the handicraft purchasing group. Inside, I always show these because students always gasp in horror, which is always really fun, because you've got the sort of recommendations here. If you're going to start producing as an Inuk, going to start producing for the South or for an international market, then please make sure your articles are as clean as possible, and skins should have all smell removed. Native tanning is not acceptable. There you go, and for approaches to materials. And further, James Houston, as an artist himself, as Gerald noted, recommended certain kinds of work to be produced, notably a cribbage board. And you see that the syllabics were used, and that these syllabics, which you saw in that first monumental sculpture, in the books that the mother and child were clutching, so those syllabics being developed for the translation of the Gospels originally. So it was about missionary work, creation of textual. The textual word was a Christianization project, but you see that. And interestingly enough, it's become important now because they're based on, sorry, I'm going on a tangent, but they're based on sound. And there's a question now whether or not in the Canadian Arctic there should be a singular written, as in Greenland, orthographic orthogony, I've forgotten the Roman orthography, right, there we go, to strengthen Inuktitut, but there's controversy because the syllabics can actually capture the many different dialects that occur across the region. But you see that he's suggested, James Houston, that is, a cribbage board, totem pole. There's really no trees in the Arctic, so that doesn't work very well. But it was just an indigenous, quote unquote, marketability. And similarly, masks. You really don't see this kind of mask being produced in the north. And today, still in Canada, there's very little understanding of the differences between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit under the umbrella of First Peoples. So we have, since the Second World War then, which coincides with the settlement of Inuit into communities, where they could be counted and educated within a colonial system, and the controversies that surround that consolidation of Inuit into communities includes the massacre of sled dogs and the introduction of snowmobiles and petrol economy, and so forth. But regardless of the fact that this was a artificial market that was created for visual art, and this is a very large Paudasila dancing bear from the community of Cape Dorset or Kingate, it's recognized now, and I quote a colleague, the only art historian in Canada, Dr. Heather Igloliorte, that Inuit art produced for Southern market is, in fact, a repository of Indigenous knowledge. And it's a little bit like the project that Jeff Thomas, who Gerald mentioned, undertook for First Peoples, First Nations, that even though those photographs in the National Archives were produced as images of a sort of imagined vanishing race, they are, in fact, a huge source of material for Indigenous populations today. The reality, when you go to a place like Canadian Arctic Producers just outside Toronto, and these are these cooperatives that Gerald mentioned, which were meant to be, they were meant to be like Indigenous business models where it wasn't one person going in for profit, but rather you would have a cooperative that all the funding went back to the community. So instead of having in some of the more remote communities, instead of having a bank, you go to your cooperative, all your food, your snowmobile, your clothing, everything comes from the cooperative, although there's more online buying now. But we'll get to some of the problems with that too. But when you go to this particular Canadian Arctic Producers, which still functions as a middle person. So there's a lot of non-Inuit who profiteer from the Inuit art market. There's a growing awareness amongst Inuit artists that they don't have a role in the business end of that market, and there's a frustration with that and a desire to see and what the entrepreneurial opportunities are for Inuit rather than just producing it. And then, the CAP, as it's called, operates in all the communities. And that carver will bring, an artist will bring his piece and get immediate dollars. And then the few that come down and see how much they are actually charging in commercial galleries realize that they're getting, a third to a quarter even of what they were paid. So that's the source of the frustration. But you see in these warehouses where dealers go to get their material that there's thousands and thousands of work. In fact, there's 17,000 objects organized by community in this particular warehouse. So it pauses one to think about the massive pooling of Indigenous, or particularly in this case Inuit heritage in southern centers, and then from those southern centers to museums and households. So it's just sort of this drain, this tap, if you can imagine it. So you've got the loons, and then you've got the bears, and then the dancing bears, of course. So it makes for an interesting opportunity, of course, lines of sculpture. The reality, of course, is that those works each have a worldview attached to them, but when you see them en masse, or you see them out of context, or you see them removed from Inuit voice, you quickly lose that thread. This was an exhibition in 2005-06, Inuit Art in Motion, and it was one, I'm sorry, it's a bit grainy, that seems to be AGO Day, but I was there as well as an associate curator years ago, and worked with Lakalut Williamson Bathory on this particular piece, and it was a revelation to me to work with her and for her to say, well, why don't you put the pieces in conversation? They're not in isolation. They're not the single sculpture. These are pieces that talk to one another. So along this back wall, and I'm sorry it's not very good pixelation, along this back wall was a whole transformation scene of a shaman drum dancer to a bear. So it was it enacted through sculptures placed in proximity to one another, this transformation that was part of Inuit worldview, with her performing a drum dance in the background on video, so the sound of the drum heavily resonating in the space, and then other figures out of their glass cases. And it was meant to appreciate that drum dancing is the interdependency of all living beings on Nuna, meaning the land where every human and animal responds to the same beat of their tarnek, or soul. One of the biggest first instigations for the creation of the Mobilizing Inuit Cultural Heritage grant was the fact that there was this huge archive, 100,000 drawings from Cape Dorset or Kingate, which remains still the most active visual art community in the Canadian Arctic. There used to be many sort of light bulbs, but now there's really only one that's shining brightly still. These 100,000 drawings were brought down to the McMichael Canadian Art Collection near Toronto to preserve them. And they include incredible work, the work of Parr, for example, who's was a practice. He lived on the land. He was a hunter, and then he came into the community as part of that sort of, colonizing community project. He drew from 1961 to 1968, and the drawings are very emotive in terms of living life on the land. So this is this sort of museum project. Here you see them in the community, taking them in a truck to the airport. Here they landed in the McMichael in 1991, and all the boxes were behind them. And these are like major players. There's Jean Blodgett, who's on the woman on the right, whom Gerald mentioned. And so this was this museological endeavor to archive, to make these survive, because there had been fires in other major communities, and so the art cooperative, the art end of each cooperative in those communities, the repositories were burned. So this was a spark. Okay, well, this is a major amount of Inuit knowledge that must be buried in here, and you can see, so far there's what's been digitized, what hasn't. They were completely rehoused into archival cylinder boxes. Pudlo Pudlat, major figure within this period of production, which was 1951 to 1989. Major figure within that, and he really resonated because he was an artist who recorded, non-traditional presence in Inuit land with airplanes and so forth, and they were all color corrected and so forth. And so recently the grant has supported the digitization monetarily of this collection, and sort of ramping up the level of technology and this intense photography. In fact, my goal is to try to find a way to get all 100,000 digitized, so that consultation work can begin in the community for those who still remember the artists within that archive, so we can begin to tease out language, what words in Inuktitut, who were those artists, tell us about it, as there's that, intense need now, and I'm a bit ahead of myself perhaps, intense need to recover the words that would be used, and to begin to really develop from an Inuit perspective for Inuit, and that's paramount by and for Inuit, what the significance of this cultural repository is, so that Inuit art history can be decolonized and expanded. And part of that expansion is to appreciate that visual art is really a response to performance and to a performative appreciation of life and to an experiential basis of knowledge that the Inuit art in motion sort of dug at a little bit. And ultimately, if I want, I'm always hesitant to reference a non-Inuit source, but if we think about Derrida's archive fever, and Derrida talked about it suppressing and repressing parricide. In this case, it's suppressing and repressing cultural genocide. Perhaps to think about archives and to think about their digitization. It's been really difficult, though, I have to say. The idea of digitizing gives me pause once again to think about this Kananganak Pudugu was a drawing turned into a print, the first tourist, and the fact that Inuit, like many indigenous populations, are amongst the most photographed in the world, and to think about what it would be if, as a non-indigenous person, to find a picture of my grandma in some unknown archive and never having seen her, an image of her before, maybe when she's young, and how emotional that encounter would be, and to have that feeling of not having control over one's family photographs. So Kananganak Pudugu takes a pot shot at this. This is a huge, the archive of photography, the archive of modern conflict, which is in London, England, and in Toronto, and they have many, many images of the Arctic and Inuit. And I just show you the front and a segment of the back, quote unquote, native girls at Pond Inlet, a major community that we're involved in, and Department of Interior Affairs stamp. But, who are these girls, and how can a digital archive, whether that be in, an archive that you land on, that you scroll through, that is perhaps interactive, or is it through social media, can we discover who these girls are, give the family back these images, consider how incredible their skin parkas are, mauti rather, are, and their hairstyles and so on. So there's a great deal of information and beauty in the image. Kananganak Pudugu, thinking about kind of a relationship with the image, that there's a kind of like there's no division between the artist and what he draws. He is a part of it, and it's a little bit like Parr's image. What he puts down on paper is a kind of understanding of the world that is shared most generously with the viewer. And Shuvana Ashuna kind of really illustrates that well as she's lying on this great big drawing. She's actually a part of this piece. And Annie Pudugu's, this is it's really about this size image of the freezer that holds frozen food in the Cape Dorset co-op. And, lots of issues here. She's exploring all the reflections and the wonderful images on the packaging and so forth. But these are people who are not out hunting. So there's another element there. And one of my favorite Parr images, where he has the entire family and all the animals welcoming you to Inuit Nungat, right, to Inuit land. The grant, as I say, it began with that idea of one archive and imagining that archive could be expanded to many different kinds of archives, and that information and communication technologies would be the way to achieve their repatriation north. And then I discovered that the bandwidth in the Canadian Arctic is abysmal. And then I discovered that, the problems of addressing that. My initial goal with the team of Inuit and non-Inuit and various institutional partners was access to the advanced information and communication technologies until somebody buys a satellite or the Canadian government recognizes that there will not be any ROP or return of an ROI, return on investment. One can't use that business model, capitalist business model in Indigenous communities. If there's only 55,000 Inuit in Canada living in the Canadian Arctic, you still have to do it. Connection of Inuit voice to objects of Inuit cultural heritage, realizing that most Inuit families, because they were producing work post Second World War, families don't know that a deceased member was an artist, that the materials just went straight south and sold into markets. So there's nothing held, no museums, no collections in the north, and not likely to be one except for the one smaller center in Iqaluit and another smaller center in Cape Dorset anytime soon. And ultimately the creation of Inuit cultural capacity in all contexts. And then I'm going to match up those first questions as access. Where does tradition live in the digital age today for Inuit? And can digitized digital culture be effectively disseminated and repatriated? And creation, what is the potential role of the digital archive in an Indigenous cyberspace? In particular, there's the Steve Loft, who leads the Aboriginal section of a major granting agency in Canada called the Canada Council, argues for Indigenous inhabitation or takeover of cyberspace. And the question is, what would that look like? Quickly, only too quickly, that our endeavor on the grant and the endeavor always is to respect Inuit IQ, traditional knowledge, or Inuit Kawiyata Tukanik, and respecting for others, fostering good spirit, serving and providing family, decision-making through consensus, always a tough one for non-Inuit, development of skills, working together, respect for environment. We had all sorts of great ideas of our partners, and that we would achieve that Inuit, that ICT or information and communication technology side of it through a company called Asuma TV. And there you see the Cape Dorset Art Archives, Asuma TV, Department of Education. This is they have this Surlerak Learning Online Object Repository. Well, things kind of changed quickly on the grant. What I'm showing here are some models of online digitized repositories, interventions. The Virtual Museum of Canada has a big granting operation to do this. This is one of the better ones. There's the Reciprocal Research Network, which is mostly around West Coast. But the idea that is somewhat dialogic. Community members can write in. Still very difficult to imagine an interactive, open, responsive online environment. Asuma TV, which they were very attractive for their digital Indigenous democracy, where they're imagining a world where Indigenous communities across the Americas and even in Sapmi would be connected. And in Australia too, what they imagined in terms of managing poor bandwidth in the Canadian Arctic were media players that would be put in communities, basically hard drives that would simulate high-speed internet access. They didn't work. What was also suggested that you can hook into the local cable network. The reality is that the poor broadband or low speed will eventually improve, but until that time, one has to sort of imagine algorithms or lower speed or smaller files in order to reach remote fly-in only communities, which are the norm in Nunavut and Nunavik. The Cernaluac Online Repository, this is the high school in Cape Dorset, or the school in Cape Dorset, which actually was burnt down this year, so that computer lab went down with it. But similarly, what I've discovered on the grant so far is that the major government organizations or standalone businesses, for-profit businesses like Asuma TV, were our most difficult partners. What we really found necessary was to leverage relationships with grassroots indigenous organizations, of course, and as those were ongoing, those were more agile, those were burning for change. One of those organizations is Pingwa, which is began in a community of Pangnirtung in Nunavut, a software startup. And with them, what we are working on is Teach. It's a program of teaching kids to code in Nunavut, because it would appear that maybe we should all teach our children to code if that's going to be a language of the future. And I don't know anything about it, which is scary, so I don't know how to control it. And if indigenous populations want to have a way to manipulate cyberspace, that would seem to be an important initiative. The government of Nunavut, in this case, is not yet interested in supporting, so departments of education, that kind of goes back to the Universities on Fire idea too, need to disallow notions of curriculum that are not based in indigenous knowledges, so that we can see a different future. They've kind of noodled around with what a responsive archive might be for the Cape Dorset material. I'm just going to skim over that. What's been more successful, I would say, is some other ways we can imagine engaging. Let's see if I can get this to work. And the sound on that is probably my fault.
Nutahtahangan katasutahanga mani tememiga pallo kuyanarsilopo ammalo sanalluni qawyigumasimayanginni ammalo sanagumasimayanginni ullumimo qanitammangaata inusittinni ullumi maannamun Sanahatakpo isimagitunnatanginni tabbani pitahangitiatnami sidapdoa nunangani.
So with Pingua, we developed the series of 6 iPad games so that one could play in one's own language. The question would be then, okay, this is another way of using technology to animate those Cape Dorset Archive drawings as Padlu Padlat is part of that. The question then, where can you house these given their size, digitally speaking, so that they can be accessible in communities. We've also worked with a Mitamalik Arnate group. This is our co-investigator at the University of Aberdeen, Nancy Wakowicz, and that if you go here, you'll see videos of traditional skin sewing. Again, we could keep those short. We need to find, though, do we try to find a central portal? Where do we put these things? Do we allow them to just exist in many different portals? I'm just going to speed it up a little bit because I want to get to a few things. Another web platform that we've got on the grant is the Nunat Siavut Mobilizing Inuit Cultural Heritage, which is Heather Gloliorte's work. We can go in and hear artists talk about their work, hear them see videos, see examples. Another group we're working with is Kagyavut. They are a performing arts organization, grassroots, indigenous run in the Iqaluit. They are an incredibly promising organization in that they're foregrounding what is the foundation, which is storytelling and sound. And they have an interesting approach. Well, there's a lot of attraction for filmmakers to go to the Arctic in Canada and to make films. They're making sure that the actors are trained and ready, that the camera people are there, that there's people who know to do sound and edit. So there's not these great crews coming in and then just people standing around watching, but that there's an opportunity for local residents to become part of the film industry at large. One particular member of the group, a young man named Nilsen Taguna, is someone who I've been working with since 2011. And I am going to show this clip, and then I'll probably go over by about 2 minutes. I hope that's okay, Katya. Oopsie.
My name is Nelson Taguna. I am from Baker Lake, Nunavut, which is the geographical center of Canada. I started performing when I was 15 years old. I was 7 years old when I was first inspired to play guitar. Although I didn't have a guitar for years, I still felt like I'm going to do something with music. I'm going to do something unique, something slightly different. And that is exactly what I am doing.
Quick clip there. So quickly going back, so Nelson mixes beatboxing and throat singing. And so we're still working with him. He wants to create his own business now. I think one of the things that Mitch could help him achieve is an appreciation of what it means to be an artist globally and how you have to manage that career, and give him the opportunities to do so. This is just a quick slide on some stats around bandwidth, and you'll just notice a Nunavut line down here. So social media is incredibly important in the Canadian North, and incredibly important for Canadian Inuit, basically because it can be bandwidth light with its embedded algorithms. I'll just show you one of our pages, but it's where people go every day to figure out what's happening and to share insights, and you can see what people's interests are, see what's going on in their lives. This was just a quick, we were on Twitter also. Twitter's less important than Facebook. This was a sculpture that we unveiled on campus. This is the maquette. This was the 26-ton piece of granite that came onto our campus. And this is the final piece. And it was just an interesting exercise that we used social media to share it, to popularize it, to try to get a dialogue going. That dialogue remained very separated between Inuit and non-Inuit, and between the perceptions of people on campus, and particularly, negative actually experience, which was sad. But it was the university wanting to try to indigenize itself. But I think until our registration processes and examination processes are changed, that indigenization won't be achieved. A very important person on Facebook is Paul Sisikwasis, who always shares older images that he's discovered in archives, and they have a great following because they're beautiful, number one, but there are these glimpses of the past, including this one of Johnny Bo Kanoiwak, one of the husbands of one of the most famous Inuit Canadian artists. Social media, we hope, will be a place where we can address images like this. This is, again, from the Archive of Modern Conflict. It's a non-Inuit image of a seal hunt, which gave seal hunting for Canadian Inuit a bad name. So there's been, terrible fights with Greenpeace or with PETA or with organizations. And in 1982, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, passed by the Canadian government, basically pushed many Inuit families into poverty because they could not sell seal products. One of the artists that worked on that big sculpture, Ruben Kumangapik, is now at this moment in Cape Breton in Canada following the seal hunting, commercial seal hunting, with the idea that maybe there could be an Inuit commercial seal hunt in the future. The seal hunt has been misinformed. This whole debate has divided amongst Inuit around it, and he purposefully shows his graphic image and this digital story that he produced recently, The Most Evil White Man, to make drive home the point that there needs to be an Inuit perspective on hunting, and this is part of what mobilizing Inuit cultural heritage should include. I'm going to skip along here to here, and I'm just going to play a little bit of this. Sorry, and Vilda, let's see if I figure out how to do this. Did I do it? Okay, good, thanks. I won't play it all, sadly, but just for you to hear it for my last point. sorry to do that. What I wanted to end on today was to suggest that perhaps at the very root here is an archive complex, something that's maybe not held in one site, but many sites, databases, social media, as YouTube is one, and that this archive complex in the digital world is a network of subjecthoods, that it's a space beyond text that is so important in considering oral culture. It's a cyberspace of sound, and I wanted to have Tanya and Lakaluk there because it is a three-dimensional space that they create with their sound that is deep in Inuit culture, very controversial. She has many detractors, Tanya does, within her own community, but it is as a non-Inuit person, a window into a dimension that is unknown to myself. But so incredibly powerful going forward, this cyberspace of sound. That any kind of digital platform needs to function as a cyber meeting ground, an experiential space, a performative space, that the thing matters less than the person behind it or in front of it, that a cyber meeting place is maybe not a museum, and that language and performance are its endeavor, and that it incorporates for the world stories beyond words, a communication beyond a single museum or museum collective. Thank you very much.